Captain Jake Martinez sat in the cramped control room of Iron Watch, humanity's most remote monitoring station floating in the cold darkness between star systems. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Jake barely noticed as he fine-tuned the massive radio dishes that swept the galaxy for any signs of intelligent life. For 3 years, he had been listening to nothing but cosmic static and the occasional pulsar beat. Earth Command called it humanity's ears to the universe, but Jake often wondered if they were just listening to an empty void. Then everything changed. A weak signal pierced through the background noise at 0347 hours. Ship time. Jake's heart raced as he recognized the mathematical patterns that could only come from intelligent minds. This wasn't random cosmic radiation or a glitch in the equipment. Someone out there was trying to communicate, and they were desperate. Lieutenant Amy Foster rushed from her sleeping quarters when the emergency alarms began blaring throughout the station. Her expertise in xenolinguistics had seemed like a waste of talent until this moment. She worked frantically at her computer terminal, running the alien transmission through every translation protocol humanity had developed. The universal mathematical constants came first, then basic concepts, and finally broken fragments of meaning that made her blood run cold. The message told a horrifying story. A peaceful species called the Villani were dying. Their beautiful blue world, covered in crystal cities and floating gardens, was being systematically destroyed by something called the Dominion Empire. These conquerors moved from star to star like a plague, strip-mining entire civilizations for resources. They saw other species not as equals, but as raw materials to be harvested. But the most shocking part came near the end of the transmission. The Villani had heard stories about Earth. Somehow, word had spread across the galaxy about the humans who lived on what other species considered an impossible world. They called Earth a death world, a planet so dangerous that only the most savage creatures could survive there. The Villani were begging these legendary death world survivors to help them. Amy's hands shook as she decoded more of the message. The Galactic Council, a governing body that humanity didn't even know existed, had already written off the Villani. They were listed as acceptable casualties in some cosmic game of politics. No one would help them because the Dominion was too powerful, too ruthless. Jake stared at the decoded message in disbelief. All this time, humanity thought they were alone in the universe, struggling to reach the stars while wondering if anyone else was out there. But the truth was far more complex. Other species knew about humans. They feared them. Earth's isolation wasn't an accident or a result of humanity being too primitive to make contact. They had been deliberately kept away from galactic civilization because other species were terrified of what humans might do. If they learned about the injustices happening among the stars, the realization hit Jake like a physical blow. Humanity had spent centuries wondering why they seemed so alone, why their radio telescopes never found signs of intelligent life. The answer was simple and terrifying. The galaxy was full of life, but that life was afraid of humans. They saw Earth's harsh environment, its violent weather, its deadly radiation from an unstable star, and they couldn't understand how anything could evolve to thrive in such conditions. To them, humans weren't just another species. They were monsters that had somehow learned to think. Amy pulled up Earth's environmental data on her screen and tried to see it through alien eyes. The crushing gravity that built human bones strong enough to serve as weapons. The oxygen-rich atmosphere that would burn the lungs of most galactic species. The extreme temperature variations that humans considered normal seasons. The radiation. Levels that required other species to wear heavy shielding just to survive. No wonder the galaxy was afraid. But now the Villani were desperate enough to call upon these feared Deathworld survivors. Their message was a gamble that could change everything. If humans were truly as dangerous as the legend suggested, maybe they were dangerous enough to stop the Dominion. Jake's finger hovered over the transmission button that would send the alien distress call to Earth Command. He knew that pressing it would shatter humanity's comfortable isolation forever. Earth would learn that they weren't alone, that there was an entire galactic civilization that had been watching them from afar, with a mixture of fascination and terror. More importantly, humanity would discover that their reputation is unstoppable. Killers had spread across the stars. The weight of the decision crushed down on him. This single transmission would transform humans from an unknown species into the galaxy's most feared potential allies or enemies. There would be no going back to the simple dream of peaceful first contact and joining a benevolent galactic community. Instead, humanity would step onto the cosmic stage as the monsters other species whispered about in their darkest. Nightmares. Jake pressed the button and sent the message to Earth. In that moment, he changed humanity's destiny forever. The alien distress call reached Earth Command at exactly 13:47 hours GMT. And within minutes, every world leader was connected on an emergency conference. For the first time in human history, political differences vanished completely. The footage of dying Volani cities, their beautiful crystal spires crumbling under Dominion weapons, sparked something primal in every human who saw it. Ancient tribal instincts that had kept the species alive for millions of years suddenly awakened on a global scale. Admiral Robert Hayes had been planning for theoretical alien contact scenarios his entire career, but he never imagined it would happen like this. Standing before the hastily assembled United Earth Defense Council, he watched representatives from every nation volunteer their resources without hesitation. Russia offered their most advanced nuclear submarines for conversion to space fighters. The United States opened their classified weapons programs. Japan provided their precision manufacturing capabilities, even countries that had been enemies. Just days before, were now working together with a unity that amazed Hayes. The mobilization began immediately. Hayes had expected to spend months negotiating for resources and personnel, but instead found himself overwhelmed by volunteers. Every space agency, every military branch, every private space company offered their assets freely. Mining corporations handed over their asteroid-braking equipment. Deep-sea exploration teams volunteered to adapt their pressure suits for space combat. Scientists who had spent decades studying extremophile bacteria suddenly found their research invaluable for understanding how humans could survive in environments that would kill other species. Colonel Lisa Parker stood in the massive weapons testing facility in Nevada, watching her teams work around the clock to weaponize humanity's industrial tools. The railguns they were mounting on converted freighter ships had originally been designed to break apart asteroids for mining operations. Now they realized these same weapons could punch through alien armor like paper. The plasma torches used for cutting through metal and solar radiation were being scaled up into ship-mounted weapons that could operate in conditions no other species could even approach. What impressed Parker most was how naturally her Marines adapted to vacuum combat training. While other species needed elaborate life support systems and bulky environmental suits, humans practiced fighting in conditions that would instantly kill most galactic inhabitants. They moved through simulated zero gravity like they were born for it, using the three-dimensional nature of space combat as naturally as their ancestors had hunted in forests. Captain Tom Wilson's engineering teams worked miracles in the shipyards orbiting Earth. Civilian cargo haulers were being transformed into warships with armor plating designed to withstand micrometeorite impacts at interstellar speeds. The same shielding that protected human ships from cosmic radiation was proving to be incredibly effective against energy weapons. Wilson realized that what humanity considered basic safety equipment was actually advanced military technology by galactic standards. The transformation happened so quickly that it caught alien intelligence networks completely off guard. A species that had been monitoring human communications for decades suddenly found themselves listening to conversations that made no sense. Humans casually discussed working in radiation levels that would be immediately fatal to most aliens. They talked about pressure differentials that would crush other species as minor inconveniences. They planned combat operations in temperature ranges that spanned from absolute zero to the interior of stars. Major Beth Rodriguez led the advanced scout teams, tasked with mapping the route to Volani space. Her reports back to Earth Command painted a picture that both thrilled and terrified galactic observers who managed to intercept them. Rodriguez described navigating through asteroid fields as relaxing, She called nebulae rich with deadly radiation, beautiful hunting grounds. Her teams moved through space with the confidence of apex predators who had finally found their natural environment, the Dominion's intelligence. New Archaes analyzed these intercepted communications with growing confusion. Their xenobiologists insisted that the translations must be wrong. No species could actually thrive in the conditions humans described as normal. Their military analysts dismissed the rapid mobilization as impossible propaganda. How could an isolated species assemble an interstellar fleet in less than 3 days when it took most civilizations months just to agree on a response to threats? What they failed to understand was that humans had been unconsciously preparing for this moment their entire evolutionary history. Every natural disaster that had shaped human development, every ice age that had forced adaptation, every environmental challenge that had seemed like a curse had actually been training. Earth itself had been forging weapons in the form of a species that could survive anything. The Dominion made their fatal error when they dismissed these Deathworld dwellers as primitive and insignificant. They failed to recognize that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to accept that any environment was too hostile, any enemy too powerful, or any cause too hopeless. They were about to learn why the rest of the galaxy whispered about Deathworld survivors in their darkest nightmares. The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Volani territory and immediately faced a scene of systematic destruction. Massive Dominion dreadnoughts hung in space like mechanical vultures, their weapon arrays methodically reducing the last floating cities to glowing debris. The beautiful crystal spires that had taken the Volani centuries to grow were being shattered in seconds, their fragments spinning away into the void, along with the bodies of millions of innocent beings. "Commander," Mike Thompson stood on the bridge of his converted mining vessel, now bristling with hastily mounted weapons, and felt his jaw clench with barely controlled rage. The tactical display showed 12 Dominion warships positioned in a perfect formation, confident in their superiority and completely unprepared for what was about to hit them. These alien conquerors had never faced an enemy that viewed their carefully planned battle positions as opportunities rather than obstacles. Without hesitation, Thompson gave the order that would rewrite every military manual in the galaxy, instead of maintaining safe distances and engaging in the traditional long-range warfare that dominated space combat. The human ships accelerated directly into the debris field surrounding the dying Volani cities. The Dominion commanders watched in disbelief as human vessels dove through clouds of razor-sharp metal fragments that would have torn their own ships apart in seconds. What the aliens didn't understand was that humans had been training for this their entire lives without realizing it. Every human child who had ever swum through kelp forests or navigated underwater caves had developed the three-dimensional thinking that made debris fields seem like natural cover rather than deadly obstacles. The mining ships had been built to operate in asteroid belts where collision was a constant threat, making them naturally suited for combat in chaotic environments. Sergeant Diana Clark suited up for the boarding assault. But her preparation looked nothing like what other galactic species would consider appropriate for space warfare. While alien Marines required bulky environmental suits with elaborate life support systems, Clark and her team wore gear that looked impossibly minimal by comparison. Their suits were designed for emergency vacuum exposure during mining operations, offering mobility over maximum protection. Because humans had learned long ago that agility often meant survival, the boarding pods launched from the human ships like bullets, their crews knowing they might have to fight their way through vacuum. If the pods were damaged, its acceptance of environmental risk was something no other species could comprehend. Most galactic Marines would consider a breach in their environmental systems an automatic mission failure. Human Marines considered it a minor inconvenience that required them to hold their breath a little longer. Private Kevin Brown's helmet, camera-recorded footage that would be studied by alien military academies for generations, though they would never truly understand what they were seeing. The boarding pods smashed through the hull of a Dominion cruiser, and Brown's team poured through the breach without waiting for atmospheric stabilization. They moved through sections of the ship that had been vented to space as casually as they might walk through a building, their weapons functioning perfectly in the hard vacuum that had shut down most Dominion defensive systems. The Dominion crew found themselves facing an enemy that treated the vacuum of space like a natural element. Human Marines moved from pressurized sections to depressurized areas without breaking stride, fought battles in temperature extremes that would flash freeze or instantly vaporize other species, and somehow managed to operate complex weapons in radiation fields that scrambled alien electronics. What horrified galactic observers most was how natural it all looked. Humans didn't struggle with zero-gravity combat or panic when their environment became hostile. They adapted instantly, using the three-dimensional nature of space to their advantage in ways that seemed almost supernatural to species that had evolved on stable, protected worlds. They fought like they had been born in the vacuum of space rather than on a planetary surface. The battle lasted exactly 6 hours and 14 minutes. When it ended, 12 Dominion warships had been either captured or destroyed by a human fleet that had suffered minimal casualties. The Dominion forces, who had conquered dozens of worlds without significant losses, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that thrived in the conditions that were supposed to make space warfare safely predictable. The surviving Volani broadcast their gratitude across every communication channel in the galaxy, their voices breaking with emotion as they described their rescue by the legendary Deathworld survivors. But their messages of thanks were overshadowed by something far more significant. Every military force in the galaxy had witnessed humans casually violate every established rule of space combat and emerge victorious. The footage of human Marines fighting in hard vacuum, or their ships maneuvering through debris fields like they were dancing, of their weapons operating flawlessly in conditions that disabled alien technology, spread across galactic networks at the speed of light. In 6 hours, humanity had transformed from an unknown species to the most feared military force in the galaxy, and they had done it by simply being themselves in an environment where being human was the ultimate advantage. The evacuation of Volani refugees turned into a running battle across 3 star systems, and Admiral Hayes found himself making tactical decisions that left his alien allies speechless with horror. When Dominion reinforcements arrived to block the escape routes, Hayes didn't retreat or call for backup. Instead, he ordered his heaviest ships to form a protective wall around the fleeing civilian transports, using human vessels as living shields while the Volani escaped to safety. Shocked, the galactic observers wasn't just the tactical decision, but how eagerly human crews volunteered for these missions. When Hayes asked for ships to hold the line against overwhelming odds, every single captain in the fleet stepped forward. They weren't being ordered to sacrifice themselves, they were competing for the honor. The alien liaison officers aboard human ships sent frantic reports back to their governments, trying to explain behavior that seemed to violate every known principle of self-preservation. Captain Ryan Davis commanded the rearguard action. His approach to space navigation defied everything other species thought they knew about safe travel. When Dominion ships tried to cut off the human retreat through the unstable Nexus system, Davis led his squadron directly through a collapsing wormhole that would have been suicide for any other fleet. The gravitational distortions that should have torn his ships apart instead became tools he used to slingshot around enemy positions at impossible speeds. Davis treated the deadly radiation storms around dying stars like favorable weather conditions. His ships dove through solar flares that would have fried alien electronics, using the electromagnetic chaos to mask their movements and launch surprise attacks. When other species saw radiation warnings, humans saw opportunities. When aliens detected gravitational anomalies that meant certain death, humans found shortcuts through hyperspace. Corporal Jennifer White's Marine unit found themselves cut off on a Dominion supply station, with no way to escape and no hope of rescue. Any other species would have surrendered or gone into hiding, waiting for the situation to change. Instead, White's squad began a systematic campaign of sabotage that lasted for weeks. They moved through the station like ghosts, striking at key systems and vanishing into maintenance tunnels that were too small and dangerous for alien security forces to follow. The Dominion garrison found themselves fighting an enemy that never seemed to sleep, never gave up, and never stopped coming. Human endurance evolved through millions of years of persistence. Hunting on the African plains meant that white soldiers could operate at peak efficiency for days while their alien opponents exhausted themselves trying to keep up. They turned the station's own life support systems against the occupiers, creating environmental conditions that humans found merely uncomfortable, but that drove other species to the edge of panic. Meanwhile, in the emergency chambers of the Galactic Council, representatives from dozens of species gathered to address what they were calling the human problem. Ancient files were opened, classified reports from early contact attempts were reviewed, and the truth finally emerged. Humanity hadn't been isolated because they were primitive or unready for galactic civilization. They'd been deliberately contained because every projection showed that contact with humans would destabilize the existing balance of power. The Council records revealed decades of debate about the Deathworld species. Military analysts had warned that humans would inevitably become either the galaxy's greatest protectors or its most dangerous conquerors. Their evolution on a world that other species considered barely habitable had created beings that thrived in conditions that would kill most galactic citizens. More troubling was their psychological profile, which showed an alarming tendency to form pack bonds with other species and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Lieutenant Mark Green's Tactical Analysis Unit had been studying human combat performance since the first engagement, and their conclusions were reshaping military doctrine across the galaxy. Green's reports showed that humans didn't just adapt to hostile environments when necessary, they actually preferred them. Combat effectiveness increased when humans operated in conditions that would disable other species. They fought better in hard vacuum, moved faster in high radiation zones, and showed improved morale when facing impossible odds. The Dominion High Command received these reports with growing alarm. Their intelligence officers had initially dismissed human tactics as desperate improvisation by an inferior species. Now they realized they were facing an enemy that had been shaped by evolution itself into the perfect spacefaring predator. Every environmental challenge that had seemed like an advantage for the Dominion, from radiation fields to gravitational anomalies, was actually strengthening their human opponents. The most disturbing revelation came from psychological profiles of captured human prisoners. Under interrogation, they showed no fear of death, no despair at being outnumbered, and no willingness to abandon their mission regardless of personal cost. They spoke about their fallen comrades with pride rather than grief, and about impossible odds as exciting challenges rather than reasons to surrender, the Dominion realized. They weren't fighting a military force in any conventional sense. They were battling an entire species that had weaponized their own evolution, turning every hardship their world had thrown at them into a tactical advantage in space warfare. The humans weren't just winning battles, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of galactic conflict by refusing to accept that any situation was hopeless or any enemy too powerful to defeat. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Dominion's home system like a swarm of angry hornets. But what followed wasn't the brutal assault that galactic observers expected. General Patricia Adams stood in the command center of humanity's flagship, surrounded by holographic displays showing the most complex military operation in galactic history. Her task wasn't just to defeat the Dominion, but to dismantle their entire empire without harming the billions of innocent civilians who lived under their rule. The Dominion core worlds were protected by defensive networks that had never been breached in 3,000 years of galactic warfare. Massive orbital fortresses ringed each planet, their weapons capable of vaporizing entire fleets. Energy shields that could withstand direct hits from supernovas protected the most critical installations. The Dominion High Command watched from their underground bunkers, confident that even these Deathworld monsters couldn't penetrate defenses that had been built by the greatest military engineers in the galaxy. They were about to learn that humans didn't think like other species, instead of trying to break through the defenses. Major Steve Johnson's engineering teams had spent weeks studying how the Dominion systems worked. They discovered something the Empire's builders had never considered. Their defensive networks were designed to keep enemies out, not to prevent someone from taking control from the inside. Johnson's specialists moved through the vacuum of space, like they were walking through their own backyards, approaching the massive defense platforms that other species would have tried to destroy with overwhelming firepower. Instead of attacking the stations, they connected directly to the external maintenance ports that every structure needed for routine repairs. Within hours, the Dominion's own weapons were turning against them, firing on their own ships with precision. That left civilian areas completely untouched. The sight of humans working in hard vacuum, without environmental suits, calmly rewiring systems while cosmic radiation that would kill most aliens in seconds washed over them, broke the morale of Dominion defenders more effectively than any weapon could have. These weren't just soldiers. They were beings who treated the deadly void of space like a comfortable work environment. Captain Riley Foster led the assault on the primary command station, her Marines moving through sections of the facility that had been deliberately flooded with lethal radiation to prevent boarding attempts. The Dominion had designed these areas to be absolutely impossible to traverse without massive shielding that would make any assault too slow and clumsy to succeed. They never imagined that humans would simply walk through radiation levels that would instantly kill other species, treating them as minor inconveniences. The precision of the human assault amazed even their allies. While dismantling military installations with ruthless efficiency, they went to extraordinary lengths to protect non-combatants. Evacuation corridors were established for civilian populations, even in the middle of combat zones. Human medics treated wounded Dominion soldiers alongside their own casualties. Food and medical supplies were delivered to civilian shelters even as the battle raged around them. This combination of devastating military effectiveness and absolute protection of innocents created a psychological impact that traditional warfare could never achieve. Dominion civilians began to realize that the humans weren't conquerors like their own empire. They were something entirely different. Something the galaxy had never seen before. The end came not with a massive battle, but with a simple transmission. The surviving Dominion leadership, watching their fortress worlds fall to enemies who treated the vacuum of space like their natural habitat, finally understood that resistance was not just futile, but pointless. They had built their empire on the fear that superior force could overcome any opposition. But they were facing beings who simply refused to accept that anything was impossible. Ambassador Nancy Turner delivered humanity's ultimatum from the bridge of the captured Dominion flagship, her words broadcast across every communication network in the galaxy. The message was simple, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. Any species that preyed on the defenseless would face the combined fury of the Deathworld fleet. This wasn't a threat or a negotiation. It was a promise backed by the demonstrated ability to turn entire star systems into battlegrounds where humans held every advantage. The transformation of galactic politics began immediately. The Volani were given safe passage to a beautiful world in human-protected space, where they began rebuilding their civilization under the watchful guard of beings who had proven that no enemy was too powerful to defeat. But more significantly, peaceful species across the galaxy began sending quiet diplomatic messages to Earth. Not seeking conquest or demanding tribute, but asking for something that had never existed before: protection. The galaxy had always been ruled by civilized predators who used politics and economics to devour weaker species with the same efficiency as the Dominion's direct military approach. Now, for the first time, there were uncivilized protectors who refused to accept that might made right, who possessed the power to back up their principles. Humanity had found their place in the cosmic order, not as conquerors or diplomats, but as the galaxy's apex guardians. Their greatest weakness, the hostile world that had forged them into creatures other species feared, had become the universe's strongest shield against those who would prey upon the innocent. In the end, Galaxy learned that sometimes the most civilized thing you can do is unleash the most uncivilized protectors on those who mistake mercy for weakness.